He did not look at her. Not once. Not when she met him at the altar, her face a pale, composed mask beneath the veil her stepmother had insisted upon. Not when he took her hand, his touch brief and cool as the stone of the ancient chapel. And not even as he slid the cold weight of the ring onto her finger, a band of heavy, unadorned gold that felt less like a promise and more like the shackle of a binding contract. Philippa Vane, soon to be the Duchess of Kincaid, kept her gaze fixed on the stained glass window above the vicar's head, a depiction of a saint enduring some forgotten martyrdom with serene acceptance. She drew on that serenity now, a borrowed fortitude for her own, smaller, more socially acceptable sacrifice. The air in the private chapel at Aldgate Priory was thick with the scent of hothouse lilies and beeswax, a cloying sweetness that failed to mask the chill seeping from the flagstones. It was a marriage of convenience, a term of such elegant understatement it bordered on fiction. It was a sale. Her father, Sir Thomas Vane, had died leaving behind a name, a modest and heavily mortgaged estate, and a mountain of debt accrued by his second wife. Honoria, her stepmother, had seen in the austere, fabulously wealthy, and notoriously aloof Duke of Kincaid the only possible salvation. The Duke, for reasons no one in their circle could fathom, needed a wife. Not a companion, not a lover, but a duchess. A placeholder of impeccable breeding and quiet disposition to occupy the seat beside him at dinner and quell the matchmaking ambitions of the ton. Philippa, at 24, was deemed suitable. She was educated, her bloodline was respectable, and her near penury made her compliant. Honoria had presented the arrangement to her not as a question, but as a settled fact, a duty to her father's memory and to the preservation of their name. To refuse was to consign them all to ruin and disgrace. The choice, therefore, was no choice at all. It was merely the selection of the door through which she would exit her own life. She had met the Duke, Alistair, precisely 3 times before this day. The first, a stiffly formal introduction in her stepmother's drawing room, where he had bowed, said fewer than 50 words, and assessed her with eyes the colour of a winter sky. His gaze was not cruel, she had noted then, but something far more unnerving, analytical, and entirely devoid of interest. He looked at her as a man might look at a horse he was considering for purchase, noting its lines and temperament without any emotional investment. The second time was at the solicitor's office, where the settlements were signed. And the third, a brief, silent ride in a closed carriage, a perfunctory nod to propriety before the wedding. In all that time, he had not asked a single question about her life, her hopes, or the world that existed inside her head. He had required a signature, her presence, and her silence. She had provided all 3. Now, as the vicar's voice droned on, sealing her fate with ancient words, she risked a glance at her husband. His profile was severe, a study in sharp angles and disciplined planes. He was handsome, in the way a remote, wind-swept cliff might be considered handsome, impressive, unapproachable, and dangerous. There was a story of a past wound that clung to him like a rumour, a tragic betrothal years ago, a betrayal that had supposedly frozen something vital within him. The county whispered of it, but no one spoke of it to his face. He had organised his life around this wound, Philippa suspected, and called the resulting desolation principle. "I will," he said. The words were clear, resonant, and utterly empty of feeling. They were the fulfillment of a clause. The vicar turned to her. Philippa felt the weight of the few dozen gazes upon her. Her tearfully triumphant stepmother, a handful of the Duke's distant relations, the servants lining the back of the chapel. She was an object of pity, of envy, of speculation. She was the woman who had captured the Kincaid Duke, a prize beyond imagining. None of them saw the truth, that she had been captured by him, a specimen pinned to a board. Her own voice, when it came, was a surprise. It was steady. "I will." The ceremony concluded. He lifted her veil, and for the first time, he was compelled to meet her eyes. His were startlingly clear, a pale, unforgiving gray. There was a flicker of something in their depths, not warmth, but perhaps a flicker of surprise at the composure he found in hers. He had expected tears, perhaps, or trembling. He found neither. He bent his head, and his lips brushed her cheek. The touch was as cold and dry as paper. It was not a kiss. It was an acknowledgement of receipt. The journey to Greyvale, the Duke's principal seat in the Welsh marches, was conducted in near total silence. The carriage was exquisitely sprung, the leather of the seats fragrant and soft. The landscape that scrolled past the window, a tapestry of greens and golds under an autumn sky. It was a scene of profound peace, a peace that did not extend to the carriage's interior. The Duke sat opposite her, his gaze fixed on the view, his hands resting on a leather-bound volume in his lap. He did not read. He simply held the book, a barrier as effective as a stone wall. Philippa did not attempt conversation. She understood that her role was to be unobtrusive, a piece of fine but silent furniture in the grand house of his life. She had made a decision in the pre-dawn quiet of her own room that morning, as she packed the last of her meager belongings. She had packed her father's clothes, her mother's few remaining jewels, and a small, worn, leather-bound ledger. She would not break. She would not weep or rail against her fate. That would be a performance for an audience that did not exist. Her husband was not watching, and her stepmother was no longer her concern. Instead, she would endure. And in that endurance, she would find a space for herself. She did not know what it would look like, but she knew it must exist. It was a law of nature. Even in the most barren landscape, something finds a way to grow. She had brought with her the skills her father had taught her. Sir Thomas Vane, for all his faults in managing his own finances, had believed in a daughter's education. He had taught her accounts, the principles of estate management, the quiet, satisfying logic of numbers on a page. "A woman must have a mind of her own, Pip," he used to say, tapping a column of figures with his finger. "For she cannot always rely on the world to provide her with a life." He had not, it seemed, anticipated that the world would not only fail to provide, but actively take away. The ledger she carried in her trunk was a relic of that education, a testament to a competence the world had no use for. As the carriage turned onto a long, tree-lined drive, the house came into view. Greyvale. It was not a palace of fashionable new stone, but a sprawling, ancient manor of dark gray granite, hugged by ivy and settled deep into the landscape as if it had grown there. It possessed a severe, melancholy beauty that suited its master perfectly. It looked like a place that kept its secrets well. The carriage pulled to a stop. A footman opened the door. The Duke descended without a word, turning to offer her his hand as a matter of form. His grip was firm, impersonal. As she stepped onto the gravel, the front doors of the great house swung open, and the household staff stood assembled in the hall, a line of black and gray uniforms waiting to inspect their new mistress. At their head was an older woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, and a gaze as direct and discerning as the Duke's own. The housekeeper, Philippa presumed. The Duke made the introduction with an economy of language that bordered on brutal. "This is Mrs. Gable." She manages the house. This is the Duchess. He did not use Philippa's name. He stated her title, her function. Mrs. Gable curtsied, her eyes missing nothing. Your Grace. Philippa met the older woman's gaze and inclined her head. Mrs. Gable, I am pleased to make your acquaintance. Her husband was already moving past them, into the vast, echoing hall. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms, he said over his shoulder, his voice already distant. I have matters in my study to attend to. He did not look back. He simply disappeared down a long, dark corridor, swallowed by his own house, leaving Philippa standing on the threshold like an unexpected delivery. She was alone, flanked by a silent army of servants under the cool, watchful eye of the housekeeper. This, then, was her new life, a gilded cage whose master had already forgotten her existence. She took a quiet breath, straightened her spine, and prepared to take her first step inside. The air within the hall smelled of wood smoke, beeswax, and thyme. It was the scent of permanence. She was a temporary thing, a visitor. The house knew it. She would have to prove it wrong. She would not be erased. She would find her purpose here, in the cold heart of Greyvale, and she would hold to it as a drowning sailor holds to a piece of driftwood. It was all she had left. The Duchess's apartments were in the East Wing, a suite of rooms overlooking a vast, formal garden that had seen better days. The furniture was heavy, dark, and exquisitely carved, but covered in a fine layer of dust. The air was stale, as if the windows had not been opened in a generation. It was a museum of a room, not a living space. Mrs. Gable stood by the door, her hands clasped, her expression unreadable. His Grace's rooms are in the West Wing, she stated, a fact delivered without inflection. It was not an apology or an explanation. It was a piece of information, as impersonal as a map. The geography of their marriage was thus laid bare. 2 separate wings, a house between them. Thank you, Mrs. Gable, Philippa said, her voice quiet in the cavernous space. She ran a gloved finger over the surface of a rosewood table, leaving a clean track in the dust. Has this room been used recently? Not since the late Duke's mother passed, 20 years ago. 20 years. So she was to be housed with ghosts. It seemed fitting. Her maid, Nan, a quiet girl who had come with her from her father's crumbling manor, entered with the first of her trunks, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror at the scale of the place. If your Grace requires anything, Mrs. Gable said, her tone implying she did not expect her to, you may pull the bell cord. She gave a slight, stiff bow and departed, closing the door with a quiet, definitive click. Philippa stood in the center of the room, the silence settling around her like a shroud. This was her domain, a dusty, forgotten corner of a house ruled by a man who did not want her. She could sit in these rooms and slowly fade, becoming as much a part of the neglected scenery as the tarnished silver on the mantelpiece. Or she could act. The first week passed in a blur of disorienting quiet. She saw her husband only at dinner, an excruciatingly formal affair held in a dining hall that could have seated 60. They sat at opposite ends of a vast, polished table, the distance between them a chasm. Their conversation was stilted, limited to the weather and polite inquiries about the food, which was plentiful but bland. He would speak a few sentences, she would respond, and then silence would descend again, broken only by the clink of silver on porcelain. After the meal, he would bow stiffly and retreat to his study. She was left to wander the echoing corridors of the staterooms or retire to her own lonely wing. She began to explore. Greyvale was a labyrinth of corridors, galleries, and forgotten rooms. It was a magnificent house, built on a scale that defied intimacy, but it was suffering from a deep and pervasive neglect. Not of structure, but of spirit. The brass was dull, the portraits were grim with dust, the curtains hung heavy and lifeless. The army of servants moved through the house like ghosts, performing their duties with a lethargic precision that spoke of a lack of direction. The house, like its master, was carrying a wound. It was functional, but not alive. On the fifth day, she found the household office. It was a small, cold room near the kitchens, containing a desk, a high stool, and shelves of leather-bound ledgers. She pulled one down. It was the household accounts for the previous month. She opened it. The hand was a neat, spidery script, but the figures within were a mess of approximations and disorder. Tradesmen were being paid late, or sometimes not at all. Orders were duplicated. There was waste everywhere, a slow, steady hemorrhage of funds that, while negligible to a man of the Duke's fortune, spoke of a profound carelessness. The heart of the house was not beating correctly. This was a language she understood. This was a problem she knew how to solve. She sent for Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper arrived, her expression one of mild surprise. "Your Grace?" Philippa held up the ledger. "I was looking over the accounts, Mrs. Gable. I noticed some irregularities." The housekeeper's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "The Duke's secretary, Mr. Finch, oversees the main estate accounts. The household books are left to my discretion." "And you are a busy woman," Philippa said, her tone gentle, not accusatory. "Managing a staff this size is a considerable undertaking. I wondered if, perhaps, you would permit me to assist. My father instructed me in keeping accounts. I find it soothing." Mrs. Gable stared at her for a long moment. There was a flicker of suspicion in her eyes, then something else. Curiosity. Perhaps even a hint of respect. Here was the new Duchess, not demanding new gowns or planning frivolous parties, but sitting in a cold office offering to balance the books. It was unheard of. "As you wish, Your Grace," the housekeeper said finally. "The room is at your disposal." And so, Philippa began her work. She rose each morning at dawn, dressed in a simple gown, and made her way to the small office. She had Nan bring her father's old ledger, its pages filled with his familiar script, a comforting presence. She requested all the household books for the past year. For hours each day, she sat on the high stool, her pen scratching across the paper, bringing order out of chaos. She traced expenditures, cross-referenced invoices, and made notes in the margins. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity that shut out the rest of the house, the silence of her marriage, the coldness of its master. The numbers did not judge her. The columns of figures did not care that her husband found her presence an inconvenience. A balanced sheet was a small, perfect world of logic and reason. In this room, she was not the diminished Duchess, the bartered bride. She was Philippa Vane, a woman of competence. She was her father's daughter. The staff began to notice. The cook found his suppliers were suddenly being paid on time, and his requested ingredients arrived without error. The head groom was surprised to find a discrepancy in the cost of feed had been caught and rectified. Maids whispered about the light they saw burning in the household office late into the night. A quiet current of change began to flow through Greyvale. The house was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to wake up. One evening, merely a month into her marriage, Philippa was working late, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the chill. She was so absorbed in reconciling the butcher's quarterly bill that she did not hear the footsteps approaching. "You are still at it." The voice, low and unexpected, made her start. She looked up. The Duke stood in the doorway, a candelabra in his hand, casting long, dancing shadows behind him. He was dressed for the evening, but had not yet retired. It was the first time he had ever sought her out. "Your Grace," she said, her voice even. She did not close the ledger, did not try to hide her work. "I could not make the columns balance." He stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the stacks of books, the neat piles of invoices, her own meticulous handwriting on the fresh page before her. He looked from the ledgers to her face, her brow furrowed in concentration. There was no artifice in her, no performance, just a woman at work. "Mrs. Gable informs me you have taken over the household accounts," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "I hope I have not overstepped," Philippa replied calmly. "I saw a need and thought it best to address it. It keeps my mind occupied." He moved closer, his eyes falling on the open ledger. He noted the clarity of the figures, the precision of the entries. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic scrawls that filled the preceding pages. He then looked at the worn, older ledger sitting beside it, her father's. He did not ask about it, but his gaze lingered on it for a moment. "The house has been drifting," he said, the admission seemingly costing him some effort. "Since my father's death, I have concerned myself with the estate. The details of the household escaped my notice." It was the closest he had ever come to a personal revelation. He was admitting a failure, however small. "It is a large house," Philippa said, offering him an excuse he had not asked for. "It is easy for details to be overlooked." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time she felt he was seeing not a title or a solution to a problem, but a person. A quiet, serious woman who had, without a word of complaint or request, found a way to be useful in a house that had offered her no welcome. "Indeed," he said softly. He stood there for another long moment, the silence stretching between them, no longer empty, but filled with a new, unspoken curiosity. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Do not let the fire go out." He turned and left, his footsteps receding down the stone corridor. Philippa sat very still, her pen poised over the page. He had not thanked her. He had not praised her. But he had seen her. And in the cold, silent world of Greyvale, that was a seismic shift. It was the first crack in the ice. A tiny, fragile fissure, but a beginning nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, a subtle change settled over the house and its inhabitants. The meals at the long dining table were still formal, the conversation still sparse, but the silence between them had lost some of its hostile edge. It was now a space of observation. Philippa would find his gaze on her when she looked up from her plate, a speculative, thoughtful expression in his gray eyes. He began to ask questions, not of a personal nature, but of the house. "Mrs. Gable mentioned you spoke with the steward about the cost of coal," he remarked one evening. "I did," Philippa confirmed. "Our supplier in Shrewsbury has been overcharging us for a decade. I found a new one in Colvin who can provide better quality for a lower price. The first delivery arrives Tuesday." He absorbed this, his expression unchanging. "My father used the Shrewsbury supplier." "I am sure he had his reasons," she said diplomatically. "But I believe in loyalty to good business, not to habit." A corner of his mouth twitched, a muscular movement so fleeting it might have been an illusion. It was the closest she had ever seen him come to a smile. A sound principle. Her work in the household office became the bridge across the chasm that separated them. It was a neutral territory where they could meet, speaking the safe, impersonal language of accounts and estate management. He began to stop by the office once or twice a week, ostensibly to review her progress. He would stand behind her, looking over her shoulder at the neat columns of figures, and they would discuss the price of beeswax or the need to repair the roof of the West Wing dairy. In these moments, she was not his unwanted wife. She was a valued advisor. He listened to her suggestions, his head cocked slightly, and more often than not, he acted upon them. The house responded to the renewed attention. The servants moved with a greater sense of purpose. The scent of fresh polish replaced the smell of dust. Fires burned brightly in grates that had long been cold. Philippa, walking the corridors, felt the change not just in the air, but in the way the staff looked at her. Their deference was now tinged with a genuine respect. She was not merely the Duchess. She was the woman who had made the bells ring on time again. She had given the house back its rhythm. One afternoon, she ventured into the library. It was her favorite room, a magnificent two-storied space lined with thousands of books. But like the rest of the house, it suffered from neglect. Volumes were piled haphazardly, shelves were out of order, and a thick layer of dust lay over everything. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper. A great collection, the heart of any house, was being left to slowly die. She began to work there in the afternoons, after her hours in the household office were done. It was a colossal task, but a deeply satisfying one. She took down each book, dusted it carefully, inspected its binding, and began the slow, methodical process of cataloging the entire collection. She discovered treasures hidden on dusty shelves, first editions, rare manuscripts, books with her husband's mother's name inscribed on the flyleaf in a delicate, looping hand. He found her there one day, perched on a rolling ladder, a heavy volume of botanical prints in her lap. "I see you have found a new kingdom to bring to order," he said from the doorway. She looked down at him. "A library should be a living thing, not a tomb." He walked to the large desk that dominated the room and ran a hand over its clean surface. "My mother loved this room. She was the last person to care for the books." He spoke the words quietly, as if to himself. It was another crack in the armor, a glimpse of the man behind the title. "Her collection of poetry is remarkable," Philippa said gently. "I found a first edition of Blake with her notes in the margins. They are very insightful." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "You have read them?" "Of course. How else is one to know where to shelve a book properly?" He did not reply, but he stayed in the library for nearly an hour, sitting in one of the large leather armchairs, watching her work. He did not speak, nor did she, but his presence was a quiet acknowledgement. He was no longer just observing her actions. He was witnessing her mind. He was seeing the woman her father had raised, the woman who had been invisible to him for so long. The fragile peace of their new routine was shattered by the arrival of a letter bearing her stepmother's ostentatious seal. Philippa's hand trembled slightly as she broke the wax. The letter within was exactly what she had dreaded. Honoria wrote of mounting debts, of unforeseen expenses, of the cruelty of creditors. The lines were filled with dramatic sighs and veiled accusations, culminating in a delicate but unmistakable request for a substantial sum of money. "Surely your dear Duke, with his vast fortune, would not wish to see his new mother-in-law embarrassed so publicly," the letter concluded. A cold knot of dread formed in Philippa's stomach. This was the next phase of the transaction. Her stepmother had sold her, and now she was coming to collect her commission. To give in once would be to open the floodgates. Honoria would bleed them dry, a slow, steady drain on their resources and their dignity. She penned her reply that same afternoon, her hand steady. She was polite, but firm. She expressed her sympathies for her stepmother's predicament, but stated plainly that her husband's finances were not hers to command, and she would not approach him on such a matter. She enclosed a small sum from her own modest pin money, enough to be seen as dutiful, but not enough to be seen as a source. She sealed the letter and sent it with the evening post, feeling as though she had just disarmed a bomb. 2 weeks later, as she and the Duke were taking a strained but peaceful walk through the slowly reviving gardens, a traveling carriage, gaudy and overwrought, came rattling up the drive. Philippa stopped dead, her hand flying to her throat. She recognized the crest on the door. "Who is that?" the Duke asked, his voice sharp. "It is my stepmother," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "Lady Vane." A muscle jumped in his jaw. He had seen the letter on the hall table, had noted the seal and the direction of the reply. He had said nothing, but he had observed. Now, he looked from the approaching carriage to Philippa's pale, stricken face. He saw not a woman greeting a beloved parent, but a soldier watching the approach of an enemy siege engine. Honoria Vane swept into Greyvale like a gust of wind, all rustling silk, overpowering perfume, and effusive, false sentiment. She embraced Philippa, exclaiming over how well she looked, while her eyes darted around the great hall, assessing its value. She then turned her considerable charm upon the Duke, gushing about the beauty of his home and the great fortune of her dearest Philippa. Alistair was a fortress against which her charm broke and dissipated. He was impeccably polite, his bows precise, his address formal, but his eyes were chips of ice. He greeted her, offered her refreshment, and then excused himself, pleading the eternal press of a state business. He left Philippa to deal with the invasion alone. For 2 days, Philippa endured. Honoria complained about the drafts, hinted at the shabbiness of the guest suite's curtains, and spoke endlessly of her financial woes, her voice a constant, whining lament in Philippa's ear. She treated the servants with a casual disdain that made Philippa's blood boil. She was a blight upon the quiet order Philippa had so painstakingly begun to build. The confrontation came on the 3rd evening. Honoria cornered Philippa in the library, her pretense of affection finally dropping away. "Your letter was an insult, Philippa," she hissed, her face pinched and ugly in the candlelight. "A pittance. Do you know the humiliation I am suffering? That man, my husband, your father, left me with nothing but his debts and his sanctimonious memory." "I gave you what I could spare," Philippa said, her voice low and steady. She would not be drawn into a screaming match. "What you could spare?" Honoria laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You are the Duchess of Kincaid. You live in this palace. You wear silk while I am forced to beg from tradesmen. Did you think I sold you to this block of ice for nothing? You have a duty." The word "sold" hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. Philippa felt a wave of cold fury wash over her, but her expression remained calm. "My duty is to my husband and to this house. It is not to finance your extravagances." "Your husband," Honoria sneered. "The man who cannot bear to be in the same room with you? Do not play the grand lady with me, Philippa. I know what you are. You are a bargain I made, and I have come to collect. You will go to him, and you will get me the money I need. If you do not, I shall be forced to become indiscreet. There are stories I could tell, about your father's final days, about the desperation that led to this oh-so-perfect match." A scandal at this stage would be so tiresome for the Duke, would it not? It was blackmail, plain and simple. Philippa stared at her stepmother, at the avarice and spite in her eyes, and felt not fear, but a profound and weary disgust. This was the woman her father had loved, the woman for whose sake she had sacrificed her own future. "No," Philippa said, her voice quiet but absolute. "I will not." "You will," Honoria insisted, taking a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Or you will regret it. I have a friend, a Mr. Mercer, who holds the largest of your father's notes. He is not a patient man. He would be very interested to speak with the Duke himself to explain the full nature of the Vane family's financial embarrassment." Before Philippa could respond, a shadow detached itself from the darkness near the far shelves. "That will not be necessary." Alastair stepped into the light of the fire. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. It was terrifying to behold. He had been there the entire time, silent in the shadows, listening. Honoria gasped, her hand flying to her chest, her face draining of color. "Your Grace, we were just—" "I heard precisely what you would just," he said, his voice lethally soft. He did not raise it, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. He walked slowly toward them, his eyes never leaving Honoria's face. "You have enjoyed my hospitality for 3 days, Lady Vane. That hospitality is now at an end. You will be packed and gone within the hour." "But it is dark. Where will I go?" she stammered, her bluster collapsing into panicked pleading. "That is a matter of supreme indifference to me," he replied, his voice flat. "You threatened my wife. You attempted to extort money from my house. You have mistaken me for a fool, and you have grossly underestimated her." He stopped before them, and for the first time, he turned his gaze to Philippa. The fury in his eyes was still there, but it was banked, and beneath it was something else, something she had never seen before. A fierce, blazing protectiveness. "You will not speak to her again," he said to Honoria, though his eyes were on Philippa. "You will not write to her. You will not trouble her existence in any way. If you do, you will discover that my resources are far more extensive than you can possibly imagine, and my patience is non-existent. Do I make myself clear?" Honoria, trembling, could only nod, her eyes wide with terror. "Good," he said. He turned and pulled the bell cord. When a footman appeared, his instructions were swift and brutal. "Have Lady Vane's things packed and brought down immediately. The carriage is to be made ready. Her ladyship is leaving." The footman, seeing the look on his master's face, bowed and fled. Honoria, utterly defeated, seemed to shrink into herself. Without another word, she scurried from the room. They were alone. The air in the library crackled with the aftermath of the confrontation. Philippa stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. He had defended her. He had called her my wife, and spoken the words as if they meant something more than a legal contract. He had stood between her and the ugliness of her past, and shielded her without a moment's hesitation. He turned to face her fully. The mask of cold fury was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, weary gravity. "She will not trouble you again," he said. It was a promise. "Thank you," Philippa whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He took a step closer. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, his voice low. "About the debts, about the pressure you were under." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "It was my burden to carry. The terms of our arrangement did not include a list of my family's failings. I agreed to be your duchess. I did not agree to be your problem." A look of something akin to pain crossed his face. To be my Duchess, he repeated softly, as if tasting the words. Is that all this is to you? A title? A duty? What else was it meant to be? She asked, a genuine question. You made it clear from the beginning what you required. I have endeavored to provide it. He closed the distance between them until he was standing directly before her. He was so close she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. I was wrong, he said, the words stark and raw. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I saw a solution to a problem, a name, a convenience. I did not see the woman. I did not see her intelligence, her strength, her integrity. I have watched you, in the household office, in this library. I have watched you take this cold, empty house and begin to breathe life back into it, asking for nothing in return. I have watched you endure my silence and my distance with a dignity I did not deserve. He reached out, and for the first time, his touch was not a formality. He gently took her hand, his fingers closing around hers. His skin was warm. The bargain I made was a dishonorable one, Philippa. Not for you, but for me. I treated you as a commodity, and you have responded by showing me what true character is. Philippa stared at their joined hands, her mind reeling. She had braced herself for a lifetime of cold indifference. She had not, in all her imaginings, prepared for a confession. The wound I carry, he said, his voice barely audible, it made me a coward. I built walls and called it strength. I chose solitude and called it principle. I believed it was safer to feel nothing. I have been hiding in this house for 10 years, and then you came, and you did not rattle the gates or demand entry. You simply began, quietly and patiently, to tend the garden. Tears pricked at the back of Philippa's eyes, but she would not let them fall. She had not wept when she was sold, and she would not weep now that she was finally seen. I did not know what else to do, she whispered. You did what you have always done, he said, his gaze intense. You survived, and you made things better than you found them. That is a rare gift. He lifted her hand and, turning it over, pressed his lips to the palm. It was not a gesture of passion, but one of profound, almost reverent respect. A kiss of apology, a plea for a new beginning. Forgive me, Philippa. The departure of Lady Vane left a clean, quiet space in its wake. The house seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. In the days that followed, the new, fragile truce between Philippa and Alistair began to solidify into something more. The nightly dinners were no longer an ordeal. He moved from his distant end of the table to a seat closer to hers, and their conversations deepened, moving from the neutral ground of household management to books, to politics, to the history of the lands surrounding Greyvale. She learned about the betrayal that had wounded him so deeply. He had been betrothed years ago to a woman he had loved with a fierce, youthful passion. She had broken their engagement publicly and eloped with his closest friend, taking with her a substantial portion of her dowry, which he had already settled upon her. The double betrayal had shattered him, not for the loss of the money, but for the loss of his faith in human connection. He had retreated from the world, convinced that all affection was a form of transaction, a prelude to pain. He listened, in turn, as she spoke of her father, of his love for books and his financial ineptitude, of the quiet happiness of her life before Honoria had arrived. She spoke of her work not as a chore, but as a source of solace and order in a world that had felt chaotic and unjust. He listened with an attentiveness that was in itself a form of intimacy. He was not just hearing her words, he was learning her history, understanding the forces that had shaped the resilient competent woman who sat before him. One afternoon he came to the library where she was working, but instead of taking a seat to watch, he came to the shelf she was cataloging. "Let me help," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "You do not have to." "I know," he replied. "I wish to." And so they worked together, side by side, in the quiet, dusty air of the library. He would take down the heavy volumes, she would record them in her catalog, and he would place them on the correct shelf. Their hands brushed occasionally, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through Philippa. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a comfortable, shared space. They were building something together, not just a catalog of books, but the foundations of a partnership. He brought her father's ledger to the library and placed it on the great desk beside her own cataloging book. "This belongs here," he said, "with the other important volumes." It was a gesture of immense significance. He was acknowledging her past, her skills, her very identity, and giving it a place of honor in the heart of his home. The chill of late autumn gave way to the deep cold of winter. Snow fell, blanketing the grounds of Greyvale in a pristine white silence. The house, once so cold and drafty, was now warm and filled with light. Philippa had ordered fires to be lit in every room, had holly and ivy brought in from the grounds. For the first time in a decade, Greyvale prepared to celebrate Christmas. On Christmas Eve, after the staff had retired, Alistair led Philippa not to the grand drawing room, but to a smaller, more intimate parlor she had never entered before. A fire blazed in the hearth, and 2 comfortable chairs were drawn up before it. "This was my mother's favorite room," he said, his voice quiet. He gestured for her to sit. He handed her a small, velvet-wrapped box. "I know it is not. I am not practiced in these things." She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a pair of pearl and diamond earrings. They were exquisite, glowing with a soft internal light. "They were my mother's," he said. "She wore them on her wedding day. I would be honored if you would accept them." Philippa looked from the earrings to his face. His expression was serious, uncertain, almost vulnerable. This was not the cold, arrogant duke she had married. This was a man offering a piece of his history, a piece of his heart. "They are beautiful, Alistair," she said, using his given name for the first time. It felt both strange and perfectly natural on her tongue. He reached out and, with a touch that was surprisingly gentle, helped her fasten one of the earrings. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin of her neck, and a shiver went through her that had nothing to do with the cold. He met her eyes, his own gaze searching and intense. "Philippa," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer conceal. "This marriage began as a contract, a disservice to you. I would ask, if it is not too late, that we might begin again, not as a duke and his duchess, but as a husband and his wife, as Alistair and Philippa." She looked at him, at the proud, wounded man who had become her unlikely protector, her unexpected confidant, her partner, the man who had seen her at her most diminished and had, in the end, chosen to see all that she was. The forced marriage had been a prison, but somewhere along the way, in the quiet corridors of Greyvale, he had unlocked the door and stood beside it, waiting not to command her, but to invite her out. She reached up and touched his cheek. "I think, Alistair," she whispered, a slow smile spreading across her face, "that we already have." He closed his eyes for a moment, a look of profound relief on his face. When he opened them again, the last of the winter in his gaze had finally melted away. He leaned in, and this time, when his lips met hers, it was not a touch of cold paper or formal duty. It was a kiss of warmth, of promise, of a home found in the most unexpected of places. It was the sealing of a new contract, one written not in ink, but in the quiet, steady language of two hearts finally, gratefully, at peace. 5 years later, the gardens at Greyvale were a riot of color. The roses Philippa had ordered planted bloomed in profusion, their scent sweet on the warm summer air. The house behind them stood proud and serene, its windows gleaming, no longer a place of secrets and shadows, but a home filled with light and laughter. Philippa sat on a stone bench, a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. She was watching her husband. Alistair was on the lawn with their 2 children, Thomas, a sturdy 4-year-old with his father's serious gray eyes, and 3-year-old Eleanor, who had her mother's quiet, observant nature. He was on his hands and knees, pretending to be a bear, growling playfully as the children shrieked with delighted terror and scrambled over him. The transformation in him was a constant, quiet miracle. The cold, distant Duke was gone, replaced by a man who was present, engaged, and deeply content. He was a devoted father, a respected landlord who listened to his tenants, and a husband whose love for his wife was evident in every glance, every touch, every shared smile across a crowded room. Theirs was not a passionate, tempestuous love, but something deeper and more enduring. A partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared work, and a hard-won, quiet understanding. He caught her eye over the heads of their children and smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face, chasing away the last of the old shadows. He stood, brushing the grass from his knees, and came to sit beside her on the bench. Tom and Ellie, their game forgotten, immediately ran to the far end of the lawn to chase butterflies. "What are you reading?" he asked, slipping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. She leaned her head against him, closing the book. "Nothing of importance. I was just thinking." "About what?" "About the first time I saw this house," she said. "How cold it felt. How I thought it was a prison." He tightened his grip, his expression sobering. "A memory I wish I could erase for you." "No," she said, tilting her head up to look at him. "Do not. It is part of our story. It is what makes this." She gestured to the vibrant garden, the warm stone of the house, the children playing in the sun. "So precious. We did not fall into it. We built it. Together." He looked at the worn leather ledger that now sat on the main desk in the library, a permanent fixture next to his own estate books. Their work was intertwined, their lives inseparable. He had come to rely on her judgment, not only in matters of the house, but in all things. She was his counsel, his partner, his dearest friend. "I was so blind," he said, the old regret still a faint shadow in his voice. "You learned to see," she corrected him gently. "That is all that matters." He bent his head and kissed her, a familiar, comfortable gesture that still held a spark of the wonder he felt whenever he was with her. He was a man saved not by a grand passion, but by the quiet, steady competence of a woman the world had overlooked. She had balanced his books, mended his house, and, in doing so, had shown him how to heal his own heart. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, they stood together in the library. A summer storm was rolling in, and the sound of distant thunder rumbled through the hills. Philippa was running her hand along the spines of the books they had catalogued together in those first tentative months. "Do you remember that night?" she asked. "When my stepmother was here?" "I will never forget it," he said, coming to stand behind her. It was the night I finally understood what a fool I had been, and how extraordinarily lucky I was. "You were my protector," she said softly. "You became the only shield I had." "And you," he said, turning her to face him, his hands gentle on her arms, "were mine. You protected me from the cold, from the solitude I had mistaken for safety. You saved me from myself." The storm broke then, rain lashing against the tall library windows, but inside, all was calm. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm golden glow over the room. In the heart of the once cold manor, surrounded by the quiet order they had created, the Duke and his Duchess stood together, no longer prisoners of a painful past or a forced bargain, but masters of their own shared and happy future. The world outside could rage, but here, within the walls of Greyvale, they had built their own lasting peace.